Imagine yourself being a passenger back in 1954. You're sitting in one of the most luxurious airlines of the time. Maybe you're sipping your little gin and tonic, waiting for the aircraft to land. Suddenly, the aircraft jolts and you realize that you've hit ground and the aircraft is torn into pieces. This is a story of a true Christmas miracle. Stay tuned. The story I'm about to tell you guys took place back in 1954 when Trans-Canada Airways was flying from Tampa in Florida up to Brampton in Canada. They were using an airliner called the Super Constellation, or the Connie. It is, in my view, one of the most beautiful aircraft that was ever been made. The Connie has some really distinguishing features. So, for example, it has a tree tail. The reason that they had this kind of tree set tail was because if they would have just stayed with one vertical stabilizer, it would just have been too high to put into any hangar. So they went with the tree tail instead. It also has this really distinguishable feature of a kind of sloping up tail section. The reason for that was because they needed to get the tail plane out of the prop wash from the four brutal turbocharged 18-cylinder engines that was driving it. Okay, and those engines, they were storing themselves. There are still a few Super Constellations flying, and if you ever have a chance to see one of them in action, I highly recommend you to look carefully at it and listen to the beautiful sound it makes. All right, these turbocharged engines, when they go on full takeoff thrust, you'll see fire shooting out of the exhaust on all four of the engines. Now, it looks terrifying, but it is absolutely normal for this aircraft. Another feature of this aircraft that you will recognize if you see it is the kind of down-sloping front section of it, nose section of it. Now, it was made like that because these enormous four propellers needed some extra ground clearance, and that made the landing gear very high. And if the nose wasn't shaped downward like that, the nose gear would just be too long. It's already almost impossibly long if you see it taxiing. Anyway, at the time, this beautiful aircraft was state of the art, all right? It was incredibly luxurious inside. On this particular flight that we're talking about today, you had a two kind of configuration where you had economy class in the forward part of the aircraft and you had first class in the aft part, next to the brand new 5 square meter galley, which even had a sink where you could wash up dishes and coffee machines and all of the luxuries of the times. Another thing that was special with the Super Constellation was that it was pressurized. It was not the first pressurized aircraft, I think that was the DC-4, but it was pressurized, which meant that you could fly it higher up above the clouds, avoiding quite a lot of the turbulence that was an issue at the time, and it also gave it much longer range than some of the previous airliners. Now, on this particular flight, the pilot in command was Captain Norman Ramsey, and assisting him was the only 22-year-old first officer Gary Anderson. There was also most likely a flight navigator and engineer, but I haven't been able to find the name of this engineer. On the day they were flying up to Brampton, the weather in Brampton was really bad, right? Really low clouds, there was an overcast cloud layer at 300 feet above the airport, and there was sleet and snow making the visibility worse than it normally was. So this meant that the flight crew had to do a fairly new maneuver, which was the ILS approach, an instrument landing system. Now, Captain Ramsey was pilot flying on the leg, and he was still getting used to the instrumentation of the Super Constellation. Okay, it was color coded. This was not something that he was used to at the time. So he was, getting ready to try to fly this instrument approach. Now, the way that a full procedure ILS approach works is that the aircraft flies in over a beacon, and then you fly on a specific course out for a specified time. You make a turn in towards the airport, and then you intercept the localizer and the glide slope. The localizer is the part of the instrumentation system that shows you if you are aligned with the runway center line or not. So if you need to fly left or right. And that is indicated by a needle that moves left or right depending on where you need to fly. You also have a glide slope that indicates whether or not you are following the indicated glide angle down towards the touchdown zone. That's indicated by another needle. So you have a cross, and when you're flying with the cross bang centered in the middle, then you are centered on both localizer and glide slope. That's how it worked. Now, for whatever reason, the crew on this particular day started off the approach at the incorrect altitude. So they should have started off at 2,800 feet, but for some reason, we don't know why, the captain thought that he was at 2,800, but he was actually at 1,800. Early on in the approach, the first officer pointed this out, but that was largely ignored by the captain. They intercepted the localizer, and the first officer was still a little bit concerned about the altitude. But when he called again about the altitude, the captain just asked him to please complete the landing checklist. First officer took up the landing checklist, and in subsequent reports he said that by lifting and looking at the checklist, it obscured part of the cockpit for him. And what you have to understand is obviously the instrumentation on a Super Constellation is not like what you would see in a modern jetliner today. No, you're looking at loads and loads of these tiny little steam gauges, right? These tiny little dials. So First Officer Anderson was reading out the landing checklist, and when the checklist was completed, he looked up and he realized that the aircraft was now at only 850 feet. Okay. So this is way too low. The aircraft is still almost 9 nautical miles away from the threshold, but it's descended down to very close to the landing altitude. The first officer immediately screams that out to the captain, and the captain reacts by pulling up the nose of the aircraft, but it was too late. The aircraft impacted terrain at about 9 nautical miles away from the runway. Because the captain had been quick with pulling up, it meant that instead of hitting the ground nose first, which they would have if they would have just maintained the descent angle, they now impacted it with the main landing gear, and the landing gear took up a lot of the initial impact forces. It didn't really matter. The aircraft bounced along, it hit several trees during the crash. The trees tore off the wing, and it basically broke the aircraft into 3 pieces. Those 3 pieces immediately started catching fire. But here we come to the absolute miracle. Of the 16 passengers and 7 crew members that was on board during this crash, everyone survived. First Officer Anderson was hit unconscious during the crash, and he was pulled out of the wreckage by Captain Ramsey and another flight crew member. But all of the passengers and crew got outside, some with some minor burns, but everyone without any serious injuries. They made their way from the burning wreckage out to a nearby farm, where the farmers had heard the impact and the shockwave from it and was going out to help. Okay, everyone was taken to hospital and everyone survived. This is incredible and a pure and true Christmas miracle. Now, the investigation into the crash revealed that this was caused by the human factor. The flight crew had not ever intercepted the glide slope. They had descended below the glide slope, and because of that, the captain Ramsey, he lost his license for a few years. He managed to get the license back a few years later, but unfortunately was in another crash in 1957, which killed him and everyone on board. So this just goes to show how far we've come with the safety work that we do on modern airliners today. It was a completely different world back then. So even though there was a crash involved in this story, I just want you to think about the almost impossible odds of having an impact, the aircraft going full speed straight into terrain, breaking into 3 pieces, catching on fire, and still everyone on board survived. Right? It is actually very similar to another Christmas miracle flight, which was the Gottröra flight that happened back in the 1980s outside of Stockholm in Sweden. And if you're interested in watching that one and hearing all of the details about how that happened, then check it out. I did a video about that earlier on this year. And on that note, I want to take the opportunity to wish all of you a very Merry Christmas. I hope that you're all safe, that you're all healthy, that you have contact with all of your family that you would normally spend your Christmas with. 2021 will be better. And if you guys are interested in the art that I have here behind me, I will link to the fantastic artist and his Instagram page here in the description of the video. Check it out. If you are an aviation artist out there and you want to be featured in the background of my videos, well then get into contact with me. Just use petter@mentorpilot.com. That's my email address. And with that, once again, a Merry Christmas, Happy New Year. I hope that you will continue to follow the channel in the new year. There's loads of new content coming up. Take care of yourself. Bye bye.